This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
So hi everyone and welcome to DBrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and it's driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. I'm Jeff Wilson, and I'm usually the co-pilot for episodes of DBrief. But this week, I get to be in the captain's chair as Louise McGrath's on the road. However, I do have two special guests to join us. Tennant, our Director of Climate and Energy, and David Martin, our Director of Emerging Industries and Innovation. For those of you fortunate enough to be familiar with Tennant and David's work, you can probably already guess what we're going to be talking about: energy and R&D. Before we get into it, first, the setting. So on the day that we're recording now, we're just 2 short working days away from the Treasurer's Economic Reform Roundtable. This is going to be a 3-day meeting of government, business, unions and experts to discuss new approaches for productivity, resilience and sustainability in Australia's economy. This national roundtable is well overdue. Australia's had 0 productivity growth over the last 5 years, and that's on the back of a pretty weak results for the 10 years prior. Skills shortages are hampering many industries, from industrial sectors like manufacturing and utilities through services sectors like the care economy, while our rates of investment and R&D in Australia are both falling. Housing's unaffordable and becoming more so. Taxes are at the highest level in 30 years, yet the federal and most state budgets are in structural deficit. How do we untie this Gordian knot? The Australian Industry Group CEO, Innes Willett, will be personally representing industry at the summit next week. And amongst many things that we'll be talking about, we think there are 2 areas that are really ripe for reform: energy and R&D. Within these areas, how do we go from a narrative about kind of more please to actually making this happen? And we'll start with and bring Tennant into the conversation on energy. Now, Tennant, you've done a heap of work about this for many years, including on some other very popular podcasts you frequently feature on. But it is clear, and I think anyone familiar with your work will know that the energy transition in Australia is going to require a huge amount of investment.
Yes.
In energy generation, in transmission, in transport systems, electrifying industry, smart energy use in households. And it's fair to say that the rate of that investment, while going up at quite a few knots recently, it's still nowhere near where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us, why is this?
So there have been a lot of roadblocks, a lot of pieces that need to be put in place to get stuff built. And just for some scale, in the national electricity market, we have historically had around 40 gigawatts of generation capacity of different sorts. We need to, over the next couple of decades, install at least another 100 gigawatts. And that is just to keep doing what we do today. If we expand our energy-intensive industries to supply with clean energy what the world economy will keep demanding in terms of steel, aluminium, ammonia, and so on, if we take advantage of the potential to onshore more of that industry, we may need 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 gigawatts of generation capacity. It's a lot. And so what do you need for that? You need markets that will pay for the product, and we have that for the electricity output that we need today. You need the investors who are willing to put money up, and there's been a lot of attention on getting policies in place that are certain enough for investors to do that. The government is helping at the moment with its capacity investment scheme contracts, and there's more to come through the redesign of the national electricity market that the Nelson Review came out just last week with their draft directions for. But then you need to be able to actually build the things that people are willing to put money in. And that is where we are currently falling down. We have approvals processes for economic regulation of transmission lines that take 5 to 8 years just to get a view that, yes, this thing is worth building. Then we have environmental approvals and planning approvals processes that can add another 3 to 10 years on top of that. And then you have the delays that we've seen in the actual construction phase of projects, such as with the New South Wales to South Australia interconnector transmission line. The major contractor collapsed in the middle of that work because of because of post-pandemic inflationary pressures and fixed price contracts. So, with mega projects, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The thing that we have the most control over right now that is not a solved problem is this permitting part. And so the recommendations that we've made in advance of these roundtables are about speeding up the approvals process and also about really prioritizing what are our asks from our expectations of these projects. Do we want 15 different things from them, or do we just want the energy, please, and as fast as possible? At the moment, we're saying, yes, energy is our top priority, and social inclusion is our top priority, and local content is our top priority, and we really need to whittle down, because otherwise we are going to not get the core social value of energy projects is what we can do with the energy they provide.
I think, Tennant, that some people in other contexts this is called unicorning something, which is that you want the horse to fly and have a rainbow tail, yes, and have a horn and be magical.
Yes.
Well, I mean, you said this everywhere. We talked about housing in the last episode with this as well. But what is it about energy that makes it so prone to unicorning in the community's expectation?
Well, I think part of the issue here might be just that I pay a lot of attention to energy stuff, so I see this there, and it's probably going on in every other context. Famously, for people who are fans or present as fans of popular political tract abundance, a lot of these sorts of obligations were loaded in the US onto the chip factories that the both sides of politics previously wanted to see built in the States. But there has been, I think, a strong agenda over the last decade in Australia and globally that was about, in the post-global financial crisis economic environment, there was slack in the economy in many places, less so in Australia than some others, but there was, a certain amount of unemployment. If governments did more directly or by inducing more private investment, there would just be more stuff happening and it would be a win-win. That is not the macro environment we're in now, but the narrative of renewables are a jobs machine, they're an engine for social inclusion, they're an engine for all the things that we want, that became a core part of not just marketing, but how people and policymakers, stakeholders really thought about the transition. And now we're in an environment where there are so many demands on the workforce, on capital, on regulatory processes, and we really want to squeeze as much output as we can from as little input as possible because we've got so many things to try and deliver. That's certainly the case within energy, but of course with aged care, with the challenges of innovating to keep up with a world that is toying with AI and transforming in all kinds of ways. We just need to be able to do more with less, rather than seeing the requirement for more inputs to get energy done as a good thing in itself.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we put out some research from AI Group just last week looking at the labour market, and there's 100,000 vacant jobs more than would normally be expected, because there's normally some vacancies at any point in time with turnover, but there's 100,000 vacant jobs that shouldn't be vacant in Australia at the moment. So if something needs a lot more, is going to create a lot more jobs, so it's probably not the time for gigantic job creation schemes in the context. But David?
Perfect segue actually to the question I was going to ask Tennant, which was around, in view of the significant amount of energy infrastructure that's required and generation capacity that is required to come online, a lot of the narrative that we're hearing from the current government and other people is about making Australia a clean energy, renewable energy superpower and the development of new industry. Do you think that's realistic, or can you give us some tips and hints what needs to happen for that to actually occur?
So there are a few big things that need to go right for Australia to realise this superpower vision. And only some of them are under our control. The thing we can control is, are we actually a good place to build stuff and lots of it? We have great renewable resources, and that is a really meaningful advantage. We just need to be comparable to other jurisdictions in terms of the speed and the cost of building stuff to take advantage of that potential. The things that we don't control include how fast do other economies transition, and therefore how fast does the demand grow for things like green iron. There's a tremendous economic logic to Australia's potential here, because China's the biggest market for an awful lot of things. China does have substantial renewables and clean energy potential, but they do not have enough to make everything cleanly that their economy requires. The steel, the aluminium, the basic chemicals, the heavy transport fuels, they could make a good chunk of those things, and then they will max out their cheap generation capacity. And there are huge gains from trade. So the faster they transition, the better for our new industry opportunities. But of course, also the faster the pain for some of our existing industries in thermal coal, coking coal, and natural gas. So we really want to make the jump as and when that change in global demand happens, and be able to meet the new demand that we think can be there.
Now, Tennant, it's mandatory on recent episodes of DBrief that we talk about this book, Abundance. The reason I haven't done an episode where it hasn't come up for a couple of weeks now. But for those of you who have read Abundance, or as we've recommended, listen to the podcast. It's a bit quicker and it's free. A lot of the way that this has been read in the marketplace is that this is all about approvals. And a lot of people will have seen that there's a story in the book about getting public housing built in somewhere in California. I think it's in San Francisco.
Yes.
It's in San Diego, isn't it the case? Yep. And that you needed to get a permit for this and a permit for that. And someone had to inspect that all of these public housing units were disabled access, so they were all wide enough to every single corridor, and you had to go and get that all checked and everything. People who read that vignette, which is an interesting story, but it's just one case, right? Really started to think this is all about approvals, which eventually at the start of your comments is about that approving things. Now, clean energy is not public housing in San Francisco. So, and this seems that, the story of this seems to be a universal problem around at least the Western world. Why are approvals so damn hard?
So one of the things is that people don't like change in their immediate physical environment a lot of the time. At least some people don't. And those people are quite noisy. And I think Australia is not America. Our legal systems differ. The details of our environmental laws differ a lot from American law. But I think one of the insights in Abundance that is good is that a regulatory system that was founded on giving community voice, which was a very understandable reaction to the excesses of the big government and mega industries transforming the landscape world of the 1930s through 50s. That backlash has led to systems where the voices of those who are very annoyed, but maybe a small minority of the community, are very powerful, they're magnified, and governments slow down their own approvals processes in order to make sure that their decisions are bulletproof against subsequent challenge. And so everybody involved is typically sincere in their objections, sincere in their efforts to make decisions that are beyond reproach. But the result is things are very slow, and it's noticeable in energy right now because we have so many major energy projects being proposed or advanced. We didn't build a lot in electricity between the 1990s and 10 years ago. Then we built a bunch of renewables that filled out the existing spare capacity on the transmission network. We've topped out that spare capacity. So now we need to build new generation and new transmission and new storage. And eventually we're going to need some new gas peakers as well. Every one of those assets is going to annoy somebody. And the problem is the outlook, if we don't find ways to get to yes, is that the price of electricity is going to go up, the reliability is going to go down, and we'll be stuck with a higher emissions economy than needs to be the case. So I was in a chat with a company in regional Victoria not so long ago who were very worried about the growth of wind farms in northwestern Victoria. Didn't like the look of them. They were worried about health impacts that I think thankfully, there's no evidence to suggest those health impacts are real. Their challenge to me was, would you want one of these things that's sort of 2/3 the height of the Eiffel Tower just a couple of kilometres away from you? And of course, I live a couple of kilometres away from skyscrapers that are that height or more. I live on a main road with lots of noise. I'm used to those things. People are not used to what is happening in regional Australia. In 10 or 20 years, they will be completely used to it, but they're not used to it right now, and change is hard.
Indeed it is. We'll take a short break and be back very soon talking all things R&D.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying
are about to
workers
impact
could
your
result
business.
in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee
The laws are
has the right
employees will have the right to
disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Hi, welcome back to DBrief. We've just completed a discussion about the difficulties around building our energy infrastructure out at the rate we need to. But I'd like to pivot to something that's somewhat related. Got this question about R&D, research and development, and R&D, innovation industry. We certainly have to build a lot of energy infrastructure, but we're going to have to build new forms of energy infrastructure as well. So this isn't just a build issue; it's an innovate, develop, new to market, new to world thing that Australia's going to have to take on here. And look, this is a topic that's extremely close to the heart, and indeed in the job title of David Martin, the Australian Industry Group's Director of Emerging Industries and Innovation. But David, look, my first question's, we've talked about a Treasurer's roundtable that's coming up in 2 working days. Productivity is at the top of the list. But what we haven't seen much in the national debate is about R&D. We've seen tax, we have seen permitting, we've seen all sorts of fiscal sustainability. There's been a debate about the 4-day working week over the last 24 hours at the time we've recorded, but we haven't heard much about R&D. What's up? Where are you guys?
Thanks for having me today. I might just actually start off by actually highlighting some amazing work that Jeff's team has done over the last couple of years about research and development in Australia. So like all things to do with the productivity roundtable, economic roundtable, I'm not sure what it's been called this week, make sure you check out all the excellent research that has been done in this particular area. But Jeff's team has done an amazing analysis about the state of R&D in Australia. And there's also the strategic examination R&D paper The discussion paper also goes into detail and a lot of the facts and background if this is something of interest here. So why isn't R&D being discussed as part of the roundtable? Well, it comes down to two key things. The first is there is current review called the Strategic Examination of R&D underway. And as this review is already underway, a decision has been made that folding it into the productivity roundtable would be doubling up and derail this already existing and very probably once in a generation comprehensive review of Australia's R&D ecosystem. So there was a decision to let that continue on the same path that it's going rather than folding it into the PC review or the roundtable. And the second view was from the government of the day is that R&D is already a subheading under each of the 5 key pillars of the roundtable itself and can be incorporated anyway. So why isn't it actually one of the key pillars? That's the reasons we're being given. I still think it absolutely should be one of the key pillars because fundamentally, the research shows that research and development intensive nations have higher levels of innovation and economic complexity, which therefore leads on to better productivity as there's an increase of technology and a whole range of other excellent outcomes that come from that. So one of the excellent papers that we've seen in the last couple of weeks shows that there's 3 key industries that actually have a material and most significant impact in Australia on R&D. And one of those is manufacturing. And I'll be happy to let Jeff talk about some of the findings he's put in this place. But one of the reasons that China has become a R&D powerhouse compared to some of the nations around the world is the sheer number and size of manufacturing businesses, firms and products and services that are developed there. Now, wherever you do your manufacturing, you have lots of problem solving. And where you have lots of problem solving, you have lots of research and development. So unfortunately, manufacturing is in recession and not doing terribly well, which is not a good thing. But because it is so trade exposed in Australia, R&D is a key thing to remain innovative and clever and competitive on the global stage. But this is something that a lot of other industry sectors, which actually have a low amount of business R&D, could certainly learn from. So just on the key facts and figures, Australia's business R&D is very, very low. It had a peak of about 1.37% of GDP equivalent, and it's now down to 0.8 and falling fast. So that is a major area of concern, and there are no silver bullets with regards to fixing it. This has been a decline for some time since we peaked with the mining boom in the past. And as part of the strategic evaluation of research and development, basically we've shown that Australian R&D in the business sector has fallen, is being mainly pushed and progressed by small to medium enterprises, not the big end of town. So why is this important? Well, firms that can commercialize novel products and services, regardless of the sector, are ones that are going to be more resilient and more productive. And during the time of unparalleled change, as we see the introduction of artificial intelligence, which is pretty much the equivalent of a new industrial revolution coming in, those are the firms that are going to survive, employ people, and do all sorts of other amazing things that are really required to keep the economy healthy. So I would love to have seen R&D as one of the key pillars and innovation more generally of the roundtable. But yes, that's the reason why it isn't, and that's the reason why it should be.
Well, I should say one of the sessions, I believe it's on day 2 in the mornings, about innovation. But this is something that's always got my goat, David, is that this conflation of the concept of R&D and innovation. And lots of people just use them as if it's R&D means innovation, or if you're innovating, you've got to be doing R&D. Why are they different, but how do they link?
But that's absolutely one of the most important points that you've raised here. So research and development is the development of novel intellectual property, either through incremental change of existing intellectual products, processes, and services, or significant leaps forward which are new to market. Innovation, which is actually the part that Australia is not so great at, especially if you're looking at our public sector research institutions, and translation and commercialization of that intellectual property is where the innovation component comes into, which is innovation is about the effective leveraging of intellectual property to create novel products and processes and services that result in incomes, jobs, and all the other great things. So you're absolutely right that we do talk about R&D and innovation interchangeably, and they are quite different. Australia's research sector, public sector research sector, is fantastic and world leading. We punch above our weight is the favorite thing that we say. But we're very great at actually creating papers, but not actually doing anything with it, unfortunately, when it comes to that side of things. And if anything, there was one thing that Ines, our CEO, said as part of our submission to the strategic examination of R&D, is that there has to be a commercialization imperative, and there has to be the innovation aspect to it, or translation aspect of it's all well and good to create things through R&D and novel intellectual property, but you actually have to do something with it. Otherwise, you're not going to have the productivity gains that we so desperately need.
Now, this comes back to the fact that there's R&D and there's R&D, isn't there? And for those of you who are big nerds and you love the statistics, I know that Tennant's pretty partial to a spreadsheet, aren't you, mate? Yeah.
My favorite.
Your favorite. It's a verb in the Reed household, or Tennant spreadsheeting. But there's two kind of ways, and there's this BIRD and GERD as the acronyms for them. But what these stand for is business R&D and government R&D, right? And a lot of those international league tables just track the two together. We've said some stuff about the difference between that, David.
Absolutely. So business R&D, basically we are thinking that there's a whole range of opportunities here to actually assist industry to increase the level of R&D, because as I said, compared to GERD, which is government R&D, or relating to the public sector research sector, business R&D is at its lowest for some period of time. We've actually come up with a series of recommendations how we think we could be of assisting actual businesses to increase the level of R&D that they actually undertake. So we'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk about GERD in a second. So some of the novel solutions that we're actually seeing in this space is reforming the R&D tax incentive by aligning payments with business activity statements, and that will basically smooth out the funding and hopefully increase the amount of cash available to smaller companies to actually undertake R&D. We've also suggested the introduction of business revenue-based financing. So that's kind of like HEX, but for businesses, to do more commercialization and innovation with the existing R&D that they're doing. And we also have suggested that there needs to be what we're calling technology uplift centers, where basically business can go to use prototyping materials to actually, and access to experts to accelerate their progress to market with their novel products and services. When it comes to GERD and the amount of funding that's actually provided to government and the public sector research sector, we've actually recommended some quite audacious recommendations about how to turn things around there. So we've suggested that we should form what's called a national IP bank, where all public sector research in universities, SIRO, which hasn't already got a commercial partner, can go to, and then can be through a standardized royalty and contracting scheme, basically be provided to industry rapidly and quickly. And then the proceeds of that shared with government, the universities, and also the IP bank to keep it running. And we've also made some other suggestions around brokerage programs and leadership programs as well too, to try and get industry and research organisations collaborating as well too.
There are some permitting and paperwork issues around R&D in Australia as well here. So David, can you bring us to a full circle with some of these things? I'm thinking particularly around the research development tax incentive.
Absolutely. So universally, when we spoke to our members about any aspect of the R&D ecosystem, but in particular the R&D tax incentive, the key facts that we got back were the following. The first was that the definition of R&D under the R&D tax incentive was too highbrow, and at too high a level. It had to be about things that had never been created and done before. And what we were saying is that it needs to be more general. In fact, other countries such as the UK have actually relaxed the definition of what is classified as eligible R&D. But the administrative burden, for example, with the R&D tax incentive is such that many of our other members just don't actually apply for it. Or there is currently a belief that without a consultant involved in that particular program, that you basically are going to be eaten alive by the ATO. And it's interesting, we've heard exactly the same types and challenges and issues. We've actually, if we're tying into abundance, there's actually a whole chapter around the research sector in the United States not being able to do truly novel basic research because the level of administrative burden is so high on them when it comes to reporting, let alone actually winning some of the grants necessary to undertake the research. And in fact, because the emphasis is on following the process rather than actually the outcomes with regards to these types of grants, truly novel, truly cutting edge, truly exploratory research is considered too risky and isn't funded and supported either. And I have seen the same analogies here in Australia with regards to the Australian Research Council grants and other types of things as well too.
And there's something in here that is difficult terrain for many of us, including in the business community, because those hoops that have to be jumped through, or the emphasis on rooting out sort of misuse of the R&D tax incentive that has led to crackdowns over the years from the Treasury, like these things do have motives behind them that many people would say, oh yeah, we want to see the value for money in public research spending. We want to see that the incentives that are offered to the private sector are not being misused. But the process of implementing that intention is often a lot more burdensome than is understood, and constrains a lot of the risk-taking where the best innovation often comes from, doing things that you're not sure whether they'll really work, but like worth a go, because if they do, the payoff might be quite large. And so the just deregulate stuff attitude that is the vibe of this abundance book for many people, there's more in there than that. And one of the things in there is think harder about the things that you're doing to try to make government policy itself more efficient or more focused on delivering defensible results. Actually, there needs to be a bit more experimentation and risk-taking. That is hard to live with. Sometimes the pot of money for innovative research activity will be spent on something that either what turns out to be dumb or just can be made to sound dumb when only the title of the research paper is published. And you can do a lot of stuff that sounds dumb and actually turns out to be extremely useful down the track. And we need to be more open to that.
There's an interesting analogy I might also say tied into exactly what you've said, Tennant, which is one of the other big funds, not necessarily for R&D, but for capital growth in Australia, is the National Reconstruction Fund. And huge amounts of money, the NERF, huge amounts of money, which it's really struggling to get out the door.
Mm.
And that's because in many respects, the level of risk appetite is not as high, because if you actually were willing to do the investments in some of these opportunities, then you would have to acknowledge there's going to be a level of failure. As like any capital fund, venture capital funds, etc., there's always the walking dead. There's the dead, the walking dead, and then there's the successors. But because the NRF has a whole bunch of public funding and money attached to it, the level of risk appetite is not as high as what you would assume. And that's actually one of the reasons they're struggling to get money out the door. And so you can see that challenge also with R&D grants. You can see that challenge with so many other aspects of what we see with government support. The final comment I might just say too is the other thing that I kept hearing from our members when we talked about R&D expenditure in Australia is that for many of them, they would rather a government contract than actually a government grant when it came to taking their novel products and services to market. Because they said that actually comes up with a level of credibility for them. And it means that they have cash flow and they can actually go to market and say they've won a contract with the government for their novel product, whether it's defense or otherwise, rather than I won a grant for this particular program. And I thought that was actually a very powerful thing to say. And many countries like Singapore actually do that quite well, I think. Yeah.
I just finished with the ironic observation that the phrase NERF for the National Reconstruction Fund or NRF, if you're in the software development environment, to nerf something is to make it soft and ineffectual. So they possibly should have considered that acronym. But anyway, look, that's all we have time for. Thanks, David, and thanks, Tennant, for joining us on DBrief this week. I'm Jeff Wilson. If you found this podcast via the AR Group website, please subscribe on your usual podcast platforms so you don't miss an episode. And if that platform lets you leave a review, please do take the time to leave one. If you've got any comments or questions, please email industry.policy@aigroup.com.au and we'll speak next month. Thanks to Tennant, thanks to David, and thanks to everyone listening. Cheers.